welcome once again. I'm very happy to introduce to you the first speaker of this conference, George Dunn. George Dunn has taught philosophy and religion in both the United States and China, most recently at Renmin University in Beijing, where he taught a class on philosophy and film. He has authored, edited or co-edited 10 books in English, including The Philosophy of Christopher Nolan, co-edited with Jason V. Ebro, A New Politics for Philosophy, Essays on Plato, Nietzsche and Strauss, co-edited with Mangotelli, and most recently, René Girard and the Western Philosophical Tradition, co-edited with Andreas Wilmes. He was also the English language editor for 2 bilingual Chinese-English books. He is currently a community associate at Indiana University, Indianapolis, and a research fellow at the Institute for Marxist Study of Religion at Hangzhou City University in China. René Girard has been a constant companion of his thought for roughly the past 3 decades. I think you enjoyed his introduction. Very welcome to George Dunn.
Well, thank you, Eric. Everyone can hear me fine? So I wanted to begin by thanking Eric and thanking Tanya, as well as all of the others who were involved in organizing this meeting. And thank you all for inviting me to give this professional course on René Girard and Mimetic theory. It is a distinct honor. One that I'm genuinely convinced that I do not deserve. And perhaps by the end of my talk, some of you will agree. There are lots of different ways of approaching Girard's thought. The approach I'll take highlights his contributions to the philosophy of history and our understanding of the emergence of modernity in its essential character. And since my background is in philosophy, I'll brush up against the ideas of a few philosophers whose ideas intersect with Girard's. So Girard's first book, published in 1961, was titled in English, Deceit, Desire, and Knowledge, Self and Other in Literary Structure. A book of literary criticism that argued that the greatest modern novelists from Cervantes to Proust shared a common insight into what Girard called the triangular or mimetic nature of human desire. Now, a study of the modern novel may seem like an unlikely starting point for a grand history of grand theory of human history and culture that would come to assign a pivotal role to Christian revelation. Yet, one of Girard's claims in his first book is that there are insights to be found in great works of literature that are often more revelatory than those available in philosophy. The novelist art is a phenomenological appliqué, he writes, meaning that it allows the objects it describes, in this case human relations, to be seen as they actually are. In this respect, Girard's work might be considered one of the latest sallies in what Socrates in the Republic as the ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry, with poetry defined in an inclusive manner to include drama and fictional narratives. In the debate over which path of understanding allows us to draw closest to the truth about the human condition, that is, to a true anthropology, as Girard would call it, Girard is on the side of poetry. Girard's thesis in this first work can be simply stated. Contrary to romantic conceptions of desire as springing spontaneously from the deep and mysterious recesses of the subject, the greatest modern novelist consistently dramatized desire as something acquired second-hand. The desire for any given object typically awakened by the presence of the mediator, one desire or even apparent desire for that object creates and confirms its value in the eyes of the subject. Hence, desire is always what Gerard calls mimetic, from the Greek word mimesis, meaning imitation. We don't simply copy the outward behavior of those whom we admire. We take them, either consciously or unconsciously, the models of what we should desire or what we must have to live with. The centrality of mimesis, both the transmission of culture and the acquisition of skill, has been well understood in the West since at least the time of Aristotle, who famously observed, human beings are the most imitative or mimetic creatures in the world, and learn first by imitation. We learn language by mimicking the sounds made by other members of our linguistic community. We cultivate the virtues by imitating the actions of virtuous exemplars. And we acquire the competencies of a writer, or a secret agent, or whatever, by following the footsteps of the most accomplished practitioners of those arts. To be a cultural animal is to be a natural-born imitator. Gerard simply takes the logical, albeit radical, next step of extending this insight from the realm of outward cultural practices and skills to the inner wellsprings of human desire. Desire is mimetic, meaning that our desires don't just gush forth spontaneously from each individual's unique and private subjectivity, but are as much learned and copied from others as are the words with which we speak. Gerard often referred to the desires generated through mimesis as triangular, because rather than there being a direct dyadic relationship between the desiring subject and the object of desire, there exist three parties: the subject, the object, and the model or mediator who certifies the object as desirable. Because the subject and the model desire the same thing, conflict interrupt, especially when the desires of the subject and the model converge on a single object they cannot share. Gerard showed that the conflicts dramatized in many of the greatest modern novels were generated and sustained by various mimetic triangles. But the mimetic nature of these conflicts is generally invisible to the parties involved. Mimetic desire is always a form of bewitchment, in which we fall under the spell of desire, not originally our own, one that safeguards itself against discovery by deluding us into believing that it originated wholly within ourselves, or within some feature of the object that makes it inherently suitable for us. Since mimetic desire works like a spell that causes each of the rivals to mistake his desire for something wholly spontaneous and original, mimetic rivalry is ideal for fomenting the most violent hatreds and resentments. Although the desire of each rival is formed in dutiful obedience to the cues supplied by the other, it is hardly possible for either to avoid seeing the actions of his rival as anything but a wholly perverse and gratuitous will to frustrate. Consequently, mimetic rivalry can easily escalate into violence, with the desired object retreating into the background, or even entirely forgotten, as the rivals become more and more obsessed with simply defeating each other. That is why uncovering the mimetic nature of our conflicts requires what Gerard calls a conversion. The greatest works of literature, the ones that reveal the truth of our mimetic relation, are always written twice, says Gerard. The initial draft reflects the author's illusion of autonomy, his self-serving belief that he is the source of his own desire, with the hero standing in for the author's own pride and vanity. But the literary masterpiece is a rewrite, produced in the aftermath of the author's painful discovery that his autonomy was a sham, since he was, like his hero, enslaved to some novel whose being he coveted and whose desire he copied, though pride stood in the way of his acknowledgement. It's this self-discovery that enables the great novelist to expose his hero's false pretensions to autonomy. The novelist can tell us the truth about our own desire because he's seen through the romantic lie of autonomous desire that his brother have also. And so, Girard declares, speaking up for his team in the ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry, the only authentic applique is never mentioned by modern philosophers. It's always victory over desire, victory over Promethean pride. This victory is enabled by the great insight on which all of these great novelists converge, though they each express it in different ways. They all expose the modern belief in the quasi-divine autonomy of the human subject as a lie constructed to shelter our pride. We do not choose our objects of desire spontaneously, but in obedience to our mediators, whom we imagine possess some superior store of meaning. The object is only a means of reaching the mediator, Girard writes. The desire is aimed at the mediator's being. As Girard would clarify further in his next book, Violence and Sacred, once a human being's basic needs are satisfied, indeed, sometimes even before, man is subject to intense desires that we may not know precisely for what. The reason is that he desires being, something he himself lacks, and which the other person seems to have. This is a key insight for Girard, though it is not entirely new. The recognition that desire reflects a nameless need or a coexistence of lack within the human subject goes back to at least Augustine, the North African bishop and church father, who held that our cognizance of our own finitude filled us with a restlessness that launched us on a lifelong quest for some ontological anchor. For Augustine, our search ends only when we discover that the true object of our desire is the infinite source of our life. Augustine's Confessions recounts the story of his own quest, his restless turning from one model to another until he finally converted to Christianity. Augustine's Confessions is often regarded as the prototype of the novel. It is worth mentioning here that Girard concedes that much of mimetic theory can already be found in its pages. But Augustine's account of desire follows an even earlier model supplied by the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, who explores the significance of desire as an undefined lack in such dialogues as the Symposium and the Lysis, where it comes to light, where desire comes to light, eros, a longing for a transcendent good that can never be sated by any finite object. Common to these thinkers, to Augustine, Plato, and others I mentioned, common to them is the recognition that human beings suffer from, we could call it a lack of being or a servant of desire, stemming from our sense of ontological incompleteness. Although our default state is one of ignorance as to what, if anything, could satisfy our law. What Girard adds to this ancient insight, is an account of how our nescient desire leads us to imitate others, whom we believe possess the plenitude of being we lack, and can therefore teach us what objects we should desire to remedy our own state of ontological privation. But the significance of mimetic desire is not only as the engine of our own private dramas and intrigues. It also plays a role in configuring the social order, depending on what sort of mimetic models or mediators dominate the scene. Consequently, Gerard's first book is also a work of social history. One might even call it spiritual history, that chronicles the vicissitudes of modern desire as the locus of mediation shifts. Different mediators stand in different relationships to the subject. The mediator may, for instance, be someone who inhabits an entirely different plane of existence from the subject, one that never intersects with the subject world. Miguel Cervantes' novel Don Quixote, the eponymous hero, takes the desire of the legendary homilies of Dunn as the model for his own knightly vocation. While Sancho Panza, Don Quixote's loyal squire, defers to his master and forms his own aspirations in accordance with his master's suggestions. Both are instances of what Girard calls external mediation. One mark of which is the more or less unabashed reverence in which the subject holds his model. In external mediation, mimesis is conscious and deliberate, the subject knowing full well that with respect to his desires, and many other things as well, he is following the footsteps of another. As long as the subject and the mediator move within distinct and non-overlapping spheres of activity, separated by time, space, rank, or social worlds, there is little danger of rivalrous conflicts. External mediation is characteristic of closed societies that are structured along hierarchical lines and dominated by the presence of cultural exemplars, sometimes living, but more often enshrined in legend, who model the sort of behavior worthy of imitation. One can imitate a model without fear of coming into conflict with him or her, because he or she occupies a distinct sphere of existence from oneself. In addition, such societies typically build a hedge around desire in the form of various taboos and prohibitions, prescribing social roles that restrict which objects of desire can be pursued by whom, and laying down rules about how that pursuit should be conducted, all with an eye to maintaining peace and cycle group. Less conducive to social stability is the imitation of the mediator whose plane of existence overlaps with one's own, allowing two desires to converge on a single object that only one can possess. This is the source of mimetic rivalry, in which each contender finds his own desire inflamed by the opposition he meets in the other. A dynamic ideally suited to fomenting the most violent hatreds and resentment. Gerard's term for this mimetic competition between those who are similar enough to become rivals is internal mediation. He finds it expertly depicted in the work of such 19th century novelists as Stendhal, and especially Fyodor Dostoevsky, whose spiteful underground man idolizes those who snub him, precisely because they snub him and withhold from him the acceptance and prestige he covets. At the time of writing the Sea-Discerned novel, Gerard had only recently returned to the Roman Catholic faith of his youth. So this work defends an essentially religious conception of the human condition, in opposition to the modern romantic view that Girard calls the deviated transcendence, which is a caricature image of the vertical transcendency of religious devotion. A polemic against the philosophers of the Enlightenment runs through this work, for they naively assume that casting off our old superstitions would set us free. Contrary to their expectations, the autonomy they offer is proved to be a false promise and a dead end. Denial of God does not eliminate transcendency, but diverts it from above to below. The imitation of Christ becomes the imitation of one's neighbor. In place of a vertical mediator who liberates us from bondage to falsehoods, Girard believes that in the modern world, we become enslaved to idols we construct in each other's images. As the modern world destroys all of our transcendent divinities, and the prophecy that men will be gods for each other starts to come true, our mediators draw closer. For Girard, the shift from external mediation to internal mediation, from Don Quixote's undisguised devotion to his idealized fiction model, to Julian Sorel and the underground man's idolatrous worship of their contemporaries who become mimetic rivals. Through this can be traced the development of the modern world, which mirrors, traced the development of the modern novel, which mirrors the trajectory of modern society, as traditional social hierarchies give way to the new ideal of equality. If emotions like envy, jealousy, and resentment flourish in the modern world, Girard writes, it is not because envious natures and jealous temperaments have unfortunately and mysteriously increased in number, but because internal mediation triumphs in a universe where the differences between men are gradually erased. Because mimetic rivals naturally tend to escalate into violence and draw others into their vortex, a society dominated by internal mediation will always be imperiled by the runaway envy and resentment of its members, unless institutional dikes can be erected to keep the violence at bay. Girard believes that coping with the challenge of ubiquitous internal mediation has been the chief impetus behind the creation of such modern institutions as the capitalist market, the independent judiciary, the Leviathan-like nation-state, and a commercial technological system geared to satisfy consumer demand and allied with the advertising industry tasked with creating it. But while these institutions are mostly successful at redirecting, reducing, or suppressing mimetic conflict, Girard believes that the social stability they produce is almost tenuous. The anti-modernist element in Girard's thought is most starkly on display when he declares that a functional society is one that is dominated by external mediation, and that a functional society, according to external mediation, is a traditional hierarchical one. The movement of modernity has been to discredit and dismantle these hierarchies, to smash the idols of the old regime, and mock the sacred laws that sustain them. In their place, modernity has erected the abstract ideal of universal human equality. And we started a little bit late, so we're supposed to run until when? Till 5 minutes to 12? Okay. So I think I may have to skip over some things here. I'm going to skip over all the good parts, I'm sorry. I know what you're saying. I thought you were already skipping over good parts. Yeah. But, I do want to include this. So here I hope you'll forgive me if I digress to talk about how Girard's insights into social order intersect with ancient Chinese philosophy. While there's no reason to suppose that Girard was familiar with Chinese philosophy, the social ideal he describes of external mediation is not unlike the Confucian ideal of the monarch who rules with the force of his love, or charismatic virtue. In a famous passage, Confucius likens the of the noble individual, or the Junsi, to the wind, while the small man, or Sharan, the man of humble social status or weak moral character, is compared to the grass. When the wind moves over the grass is sure death, says Confucius. No doubt, Girard would attribute this almost magical potency of the to the power of nemesis exercised in a setting of external mediation. It's likely that this ideal existed perfectly nowhere except in the minds of certain philosophers. It was something aspired for rather than fully realized. But its presence as a goal suggests that the best minds of the pre-modern world did have some understanding of the dangers of mimetic design and sought ways to direct it into relatively benign channels. Pre-modern societies vary in their conceptions of moral perfection. But from Girard's perspective, what matters is not so much the particular cultural ideals that structure desire in these various societies, but their employment of external mediation to erect an embankment against the spread of invidious mimetic violence. However, once equality as an ideal and reality comes to define all social relations, the opportunities for internal mediation, envy, resentment, and rivalry proliferate. As Thomas Hobbes observed in his account of the state of nature, the more equal we are, the more likely we are to become enemies when our desires alight on the same things. And just as Hobbes believed that a war of all against all was an inescapable consequence of the snowballing enmity of men in the state of nature when there is no power able to overawe them all, so too the discrediting of the legitimacy of pre-modern social hierarchies deprives us of what Girard believes had been our best defense against the rampant contagion of mimetic confidence, sending us in search of institutional subtlety. But we shouldn't conclude that Girard wanted to turn back the clock and reinstate the pre-modern social order, which was never as idyllic as the popular storybook descriptions of it might have us believe. In an aphorism titled "A Word in the Conservative's Ear," Friedrich Nietzsche, who had deep reservations of his own about the consequences of modernity, reminded his reactionary auditors that the world had progressed to a point from which a progressive development or turnaround in any way, shape, or form is absolutely impossible. No one is free to be proud. So though an unmistakable nostalgia for the pre-modern world can be discerned in many of Girard's early writings, a few years after the publication of his first book, his research veered in a different direction that showed that he too had concluded that it was neither possible nor desirable to be a brand. These earlier societies of knights and patricians were never all that idyllic. Indeed, Girard's later research persuaded him that the external mediation that structured these pre-modern societies had emerged only as the damning home of an earlier outbreak of internal mediation and rampant rivalry that culminated in an explosive discharge of violence from which the social order as we know it was born. Now, if human societies are threatened by violence, this must have repercussions for the organization of human groups, he observed in an interview describing the genesis of the next phase of his life. In turn, I said to myself, if there is a normal order of society, it must be the result of a prior crisis. It must be the resolution of that crisis. In his next major work, Violence and Sacred, published in 1972, Thoreau turned to archaic myths and classical Greek tragedy to uncover the mechanism that he believed generated and undergirded all of human culture and generated the social orders that we know. He invites us to imagine a community in which social solidarity has devolved into ubiquitous mimetic rivalry, with neither established social hierarchies nor anything like our modern system of jurisprudence to staunch the tide of hostility as it swells toward a violent war of all against all. In such a situation, the survival of the community depends on redirecting its violence outward in an act of scapegoating, either spontaneous or engineered, against a victim who can be blamed for the disorder afflicting the community. Thoreau routinely referred to this way of resolving social crisis as the scapegoat mechanism, using that word to highlight how it operates with the same lying efficacy as any causal process, without any conscious direction from rational agents. This mechanism exploits the mimetic propensities of human beings, but instead of imitating each other's acquisitive gestures, we imitate each other's accusative gestures. We need only imagine one person directing an accusation at another member of the community in a forceful enough manner to induce others to imitate the gesture of blame. The gravitational pull of nemesis ensures that eventually all fingers will be pointing in the same direction, uniting the formerly fractured community against some designated villain whom we can all agree to blame. It's not necessary for the victim to be actually guilty of anything for this mimetic mechanism to work. The community need only come to unanimous agreement as to his guilt, with all their hostility now directed toward an arbitrarily chosen victim. The once warring members of the community are now reconciled, united in a collective act of killing or expelling the scapegoat. According to Girard, the cultural memory of the cathartic effects of these episodes of scapegoating is preserved in a distorted fashion in the various myths and rituals of traditional societies. Many or most pre-modern civilizations have founding myths that depict the death of an outsider in the hands of the community, though the victim is invariably depicted as guilty rather than the arbitrary victim of scapegoating frenzy. Most also perform regular ritual sacrifice that Girard believes are reenactments of the founding scapegoating violence. In addition, these societies institute often elaborate prohibitions and taboos designed to prevent the recurrence of a mimetic crisis. Myth, sacrifice, and prohibitions. These institutions and practices all arise out of the original paroxysm of violence that founded the community. They'll testify in some distorted way to the character of that foundation, and they all play a vital role in sustaining the post-crisis social order. Around the time of the European Renaissance, this old social order began to crumble. But Girard believes that the groundwork for this revolution had been prepared millennia earlier. In our world, he writes, sacrificial means have degenerated more and more as victimage, oppression, and persecution have become predominant issues. No return to the rigidities of prohibition rituals in sight, and some very special cause must be found to account for this unique evolution. I have an answer to propose, and it is the presence of the biblical text in our midst. This was the insight that Gerard unpacked in his third great book, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. Gerard came to believe that he had discovered a revelation of the scapegoat mechanism in a number of biblical narratives that deconstruct the usual mythological depiction of criminal scapegoat in innocent community. According to Gerard, biblical texts such as the Joseph cycle in the book of Genesis, the book of Job, the servant songs in Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and above all, the passion narratives of the gospel, establish the innocence of the victim and reveal the untruth of the scapegoating community. These biblical narratives break from the mythological template by explicitly coming to the defense of the victim. Of course, biblical texts also contain no shortage of narratives that conform in various ways to the standard persecutory storyline of the mythological texts that underwrite the community's violence against scapegoats. Gerard did not deny this fact. Yet what is most distinctive of the biblical text in his view was the unprecedented frequency with which it sides with it. He believed that the presence of the biblical text within Western societies had taken the heart of his anti-sacrificial narrative that progressively disabled the scapegoating mechanism as an instrument for resolving social crises, since this mechanism can operate with full vigor only as long as we're blind to what we're doing. Looking to see what I can see. Maybe we should just press on to the end here. Okay. So this biblical concern for persecuted victims has become politicized in the modern movements for democracy, human rights, and socialism. These are Christianity's offspring, even though their standard bearers of these movements often were openly hostile to Christianity. As Gerard has said, we are always prepared to translate all of our conflicts, even those that don't lend themselves at all to it, into the language of innocent victims. The politicized political constituencies that dominate democratic politics thus fall into intense mimetic rivalries precisely over who gets to claim the high moral ground of being the real defenders of the real victims. Take, for example, the question of abortion, which, as Gerard noted, is no longer formulated except in the following terms. Who is the real victim? Is it the child, or is it the mother? You can no longer defend a given position, or any, he says, except by making it into a contribution into the anti-victim narrative. The language in which these debates are typically conducted points to another feature of our modern moral discourse, this preoccupation with rights, which Gerard also relates to the moral concerns awakened by the biblical narrative. The essential thing, he says, in what goes now as human rights, is an indirect acknowledgement of the fact that every individual, or every group of individuals, can become the scapegoats of their own community. Gerard notes that over the course of recent centuries, both traditional systems of morality and their modern ideological successors have all been progressively discredited until, at last, the concern for victims, along with the belief in equal rights, has survived as our last remaining moral absolute, the only source of common moral life. Freud's work is indispensable for understanding the profound paradox of the modern world. Due to the influence of Christianity, our world is more tolerant, more humane, more productive, and more beneficent in every way. Yet, the modern world is at the same time rife with conflict, born of envy and resentment, which Gerard attributed to the pervasiveness of internal mediation after the collapse of the old hierarchical social. With the collapse of sacrificial structures, traditional hierarchies, and internal mediation that once shielded us from our own violence, humanity faces unprecedented dangers, according to Girard. Our future, he believes, will be decided by power and compassion, who's equal to the new moral demands placed on us by our novel social situation, in which we can no longer rely on the protections afforded by traditional hierarchies and external mediation. Since social equality establishes relationships that are possible, everything hinges on what form that reciprocity takes. Gerard proposed the alternative we face in his last book, Better to the End, in which he evoked the figure of Christ as pointing to the only viable path forward. Quoting from Better to the End, Gerard says, Christ, the last prophet, then places humanity before a terrible alternative. Either continue to refuse to see that the dual is the underlying structure of all human activities, the dual that is mimetic life, or escape from that hidden logic by means of a better one, that of love, of positive resonance. In this respect, it is striking how closely negative and positive reciprocity resemble each other. Almost the same form of undifferentiation is involved in both cases. But what is at stake is the salvation of man. I'll just look up in there. Thank you. Thank you for
We are very proud to have keynote speakers come from all over the world. I felt like a child with a new toy, given the reins of this colloquium, because I was able to make up my dream team of speakers, and they all are here, so please enjoy them. And I will introduce Professor Guillermo. He teaches at the Graduate School of Mesoamerican Studies at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. He leads a research program on the sacrificial meaning of the practice of heart extraction in pre-Columbian cultures as a structural ritual, and has published widely on the anthropological implications of myth and the ritual uses of war and hunting. Professor Olivier has received numerous prizes and accolades for his research and museography achievements. His latest book, Mockeries and Metamorphoses of an Aztec God, Scatlipoca, Lord of the Smoky Mirror, deals with the enigmatic figure of the god of sorcery and incest that, from the shadows, keeps the cycle of violence alive. So please welcome Professor Guillermo.
Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this event. I will speak about human sacrifice among the Mexican, our people from the Tenochtitlan and the places around. As you know, it's quite a difficult topic, especially because of the sources we have about it. First of all, we have the Spaniard chronicles, like Cortes or Bernardino de Castillo, and obviously they exaggerate the sacrificial phenomenon. Obviously they wanted to justify the conquest, and it is very noteworthy to see how they associated idolatry, sacrifice, and sodomy. All these characters they attributed to the Aztecs were meant to be destroyed by the conquest. And these images of human sacrifice is part of the diabolization of the indigenous people. Other sources, very important to my topic, is the Friars' Chronicles. As you know, they wanted to destroy the Aztec religion. So we can see these images from the Lienzo of Tlaxcala, how they burned the temple, and interestingly, we saw the devils escaping from the flames. So we have a clear association between the Aztec gods and the devils, European devils. Anyway, these friars, to be able to destroy the Aztec religion, need also to investigate the old customs of the Indians, and they produce very important books describing the Aztec religion. We have, for example, the Trinity Codex, which was Friar Bernardino de Sahagún enterprise with Nahuatl collaborators. So we have part of this book in Spanish, but a very important part is written in Aztec language, in Nahuatl, and it's very important to know the Aztec conceptions of human sacrifice. Well, we have here another important part of the Florentine Codex, and this is the images that illustrate this work. And at the right down, we have another image from the work of the Dominican friar Diego de Ram, which is another source very important. Aztec ritual and Aztec sacrifice. These friars also reproduced some Aztec codex, and they have copy made, and with some comments, and also some exaggerations, like these images of the death goat, and the ritual to cover the statue of the goat with human blood. In the Templo Mayor, they found, specifically Leonardo Lopez Lujan, archaeologist, found two statues of Mictlantecuhtli next to this place, just to the other side of the street. And they analyzed this statue, and they realized that human blood was effectively drawn on the stage. So it's not so exaggerated. Other materials about human sacrifice are to be found in ancient codices. In the upper part, we have images from Mixtec codices, pre-Hispanic codices. And in the lower part, we have an image of the Codex of Dresden, the Maya codices, and an image of a ceramic vessel. So all these materials are pre-Hispanic. We have also interesting Maya iconography from Chichen Itza. For example, a gold vessel with the representation of a human sacrifice. And we have this reconstruction, a little romantic, right? With the maiden who was thrown into the famous cenote of Chichen Itza. Now we know that many people were sacrificed in this place, but not especially young ladies. Whereas adults and children, so a little different. With this mention of archaeological finding, we can realize the reality of human sacrifice. As you know, there is not many, but some scholars who have doubt about the reality of human sacrifice, but now there is many, the last 20, 30 years, there were many physical anthropologists who made studies with, for example, the skulls of the victims. Here this is a skeleton from Teotihuacan, and obviously these people were sacrificed, and there is marks on the bones that reveals the type of sacrifice, the type of death they have been searched. Another example from the Templo Mayor, there is a true skeleton of children who have been found in Templo Mayor. These children are drawn like Huitzilopochtli, the tutelary goat of the Aztecs, and physical anthropologists found reveals that this little boy, about 8 years old, has been sacrificed by his heart extraction. Now, if we go through the myth of the Aztec, we have many relation of the origin of human sacrifice. For example, when Huitzilopochtli was born, he appears like a warrior, and he sacrificed his sister and other people. And one source said that he was actually eating the heart of the victims. Other myths, like the origin of the sun and moon, also explain that the sun and the moon have the necessity of the sacrifice of the other gods to go through the sky. So we have another mention of the sacrifice of the gods to make the sun and the moon move in the sky, and human beings are obliged to realize the same sacrifice, make the moon and the sun move in the sky. Especially, there is another myth. This is the origin of the sacred war, who speak about some deities called Mimishkoa, who have been transgressors. They get drunk, they lie with women, and so they are condemned to be sacrificed, and the source said that their blood and their heart will nourish the cell. So I would like to emphasize my talk about the human heart sacrifice, and especially to see who were the goats and the human who were benefited from heart sacrifice. If we see the codices, in this case, old manuscripts from the Borgia group, we can see some deities with representation of the heart. In the case of the death goat, we can see in the upper part, the death god, he has his breast open with the heart and blood going out, but at the same time, with one hand, is sustaining the human heart, and with the other, he seems to take it for eating. So it's such a strange representation, because the deity seems to be sacrificed and also to benefit from the sacrifice. This is a kind of theory that equates the people who make the sacrifice and the sacrifice victim. We have an association very clear in some sources that the people who offer the sacrifice identify themselves with the victim. Something very broad. It is in India and other countries. Sorry. In another image, to the right, we see the death goat, but this time is sacrificing a human being, and the context is an eclipse. So we know that people with white skin were sacrificed on this occasion, and what I would like to insist on is that with one hand is sacrificing the victim, and with the other he put the heart on high. He raised the heart. This is a very important act. We can see the same phenomenon with Quetzalcoatl here in the Codex Borgia, sacrificing the maize goat, and with one hand he opens the breast, and with the other he raised the heart. And we see the blood, the human blood, going to Tezcatlipoca, who is drinking the human blood from the sacrifice. And we see this extraordinary representation. This is the night sun, the black figure, and we can see many goats participating in the death, the sacrifice of the sun god. Some people interpret this scene as an eclipse. And in the same manner, we see that each goat uses a flint knife to sacrifice the night goat, and with the other hand, they raise the human heart. This example is from Coixtlahuaca, from Oaxaca, and I put it first because we can see the same gesture of raising the human heart, but in this case, this is a woman who is acting as a sacrificer, and this is an exceptional case as far as I know. and it is in a place, in a ball game place. In this representation from colonial time, Codex Americano, we can see the heart literally flying up. And other representation, for example, in the Codex, the Florentine Codex, here we can see the representative of the god Tezcatlipoca. This was a noble prisoner. He was deified as Tezcatlipoca, and at the end of the ritual, he was sacrificed on the top of a pyramid, a little pyramid, and here we can see the representation of the sun in a European manner, that actually this is the sun who is beneficiated by the human sacrifice. Another image from the Florentine Codex. Here again, the sun is clearly shown as beneficence of the sacrifice. And if we read the Nahuatl text that accompanies this representation, the translation is, and when he had mounted all the steps, when he had risen to the summit, then the offering priest tied him. They threw him upon his back on the sacrificial stone. Then one of them cut open his breast. He took his heart from him. He also raised it in dedication to the sun of magic. We saw that one of the gestures was to raise the heart. We have other comments who talk about throwing the heart, like if it was a ball. And one of the mythical evidence when we saw this gesture is the foundation of Tenochtitlan. The sources speak about a man called Copil who was sacrificed by Huitzilopochtli or another member of the Mexica people, and they said that his heart was thrown in the middle of the lake, and from it was born the nopal cactus. And from this nopal cactus, they knew the place where Tenochtitlan was to be found, and the eagle was the symbol of this place who will become the capital of the Aztec Empire. So we have this gesture of throwing the heart. We have some description of this gesture. For example, in one Ventena ritual named Shokotwetsi, and they say that captives were burned, and I quote, and the brave warrior flesh thereupon sputum, blister quickly formed. Then all priests quickly seized him, they quickly drew him forth, they stretched him out on the offering stone, they cut upon his breast, they slit over his chest. Then they cut out, they tore out his heart, they cast it before Chiltecutli, the representation of fire. And in the Spanish version, they say that the heart was thrown to the stage of the god. There is another comment interesting in the work of Lopez de Gomara. He said that the heart was thrown to the face of the stage, and that if they actually throws the heart to the face, it was a good sign. And this could be a way of speaking of the divinatory aspect of human sacrifice. And we have some element to take into consideration this divinatory aspect of human sacrifice. For example, we know that the people who are chosen to be sacrificed must be with special characteristics. For example, to represent the Tlaloque, the rain gods, they choose children because they think that the Tlaloque were people like small people. At the same time, these children must be crying because crying was the same thing like raining. In other sources, they speak of some warrior who have to be sacrificed, and they choose them with strong aspect and strong spirit. We have some sources that speak of a warrior who was crying, and this was very bad. It was not functioning this way. At the same time, we have some elements that describe the extraction of the heart, and the heart was put on the floor, and it was moving a little. And this movement of the heart also has a kind of signification. We have another text, very important, in the Florentine Codex, and it is speaking of the apparition of Tezcatlipoca. He was the god of destiny, he was the god of the king also, the representative of the king, and sometimes in the night, Tezcatlipoca appeared in the wood, the forest, and he was, like you can see in this image, he appears decapitated and with the breast open. Some valiant people, priest or warrior, were able to sight the heart of the deity, and I will read a small fragment about it. Whether priest or reckless warrior, when he had succeeded in reaching him, then saw his heart. He seized it, he clutched at it and took it tightly in his fist. He tore it out, so he demanded what he would give, grant or reward him, perhaps riches, perhaps the taking of captive, perhaps valor or poverty. So there is a kind of divinatory aspect of this confrontation with the god. If the people were very brave, they can get captive in the field, in the war field. And all other people who were not so brave, they just take out the heart and run, and then they, I quote, they bury the heart somewhere. He wrapped it, and later, when he got down, he looked at it, and then it showed him whether his fortune were good and propitious or not. So the heart was buried, and then they can show the aspect of the heart. Sometimes there were feathers, sometimes there were rags or charcoal. The feathers or spine, maggot spine, were a good augury, and the charcoal and the rags were very bad sign. So there is a divinatory dimension of the heart, of the sacrifice. Now, This object is called Oshikani. It was a recipient for human heart, and we can see in the bottom of the recipient the glyph for movement. This is a calendrical name of the sun, and more down we can see the representation of the earth deity, who also was one of the deities who can eat human heart. I don't realize when I begin. How many times I have? Sorry. Could be. No? So this is a representation of the Florentine products. And we can see which is washed in a very strange way, like European demon, you know, with or Egyptian god with this head of a hummingbird. But the interest here is that the text speaks of this falcon and say that the falcon nourishes the sun with human heart. So Huitzilopochtli is here representing the sun residing in the human heart to eat. We have other representation of the sun feeding with human heart in Chichen Itza, for example, in the Mixtec codices, in Maya codices. These are the hearts here also. But we have also representation of the moon residing in human heart. For example, the Codex Borgia. This is a moon, and this is a human heart. You see the flow of blood rising to the moon in a temple. Other deities who reside in human hearts is Itzpapalot, the obsidian butterfly, and she appears, for example, in this realm here. There are human hearts. This is a goddess of earth. She's very like Tlaltecuhtli. This is not the kind of mother earth, you know, very kind. No, just the contrary. This deity eats people when they died, and you can see that this mouth has flint like teeth. And this flint were used to sacrifice people. Also, we have this representation of the earth deity, Coatlicue. Certainly you saw it in the National Museum of Anthropology. And here we have a necklace, very peculiar, with hands and human heart. This is a bone rattle made from a human femur, and we have this representation of the earth deity, and also she has human heart in her hand. The iconography is very impressive. In Mesoamerica, there is a very rich symbolism. Now, the sacrifice of children that I mentioned previously, also we have text that describe what happened with the heart of the children. And I read a translation from Nahuatl. During the maintenance of Quetzalcoatl, they went to a place called Antitlan, a kind of lake, and this is what the sources say. When they slashed open the breast of the victim, of the representative of the rain gods, they seized his heart. They went to place in a vessel painted blue, named the Cloud Vessel. The friar priest arose in the prow of the boat. Then they gave him the cloud vessel, which went filled with hearts. Thereupon he cast it in the middle of the water. It immediately was swallowed, and the water foam kept surging, roll, crackle continually. This idea of the water making movement was also a kind of sign that the boat had accepted the sacrifice, another divinatory aspect of this ritual. We have another example with the sacrifice of children in Mexico Tenochtitlan. This is a representation in the Atlas of Diego de Gran, the Dominican friar, and we can see clearly the young children with the breast open. Other deities will recite the heart of the victim of sacrifice, like the death deity. Another god was Xipetotec, the flayed god, who recites the heart of the warrior who fight in the famed gladiatorial sacrifice. And we have to speed a little, so we are going to the human people who can get a heart to eat. And we have some sources that speak of the priest. Some priests have the privilege to eat a human heart and also human feet and human hands. This is an image of the Codex Borgia, and we can see a priest. We recognize it because he has blood in this part of the head, and he's carrying his vessel with hand and feet, and other human people can eat human heart. This is the king, the Aztec king. Other pieces of the victim that he can eat was legs, was the principal part of the victim that was consumed. In the case of the king, we have a ritual during which the statue of Huitzilopochtli was made with amaranth seed, and the heart of the statue was given to the Tlatoani, the Aztec king. And this speaks about an important dimension of the power of the king. The king is the double, the animal double, the nahual of the king was a jaguar. The jaguar was also the animal of Tezcatlipoca, double of Tezcatlipoca. And one Nahuatl word explains this characteristic. This is Tecuani, eater of the people. And we have texts that speak of the king, of the Aztec king, as eater of people. And this is something we find in other divine kingship. For example, in Africa, when we have also ritual during which the king would eat some people, and the double of the king in this case is a bouncer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for introducing me. And I would also like to thank the organization for this lovely event and for my invitation to be here with you today. So I will talk today about Aztec cannibalism. My lecture is divided into 4 parts. First, before I start talking on Aztec cannibalism, I would like to say some words about the book of William Aren's Man-Eating Myth. Then I will go on with some historical facts on Aztec cannibalism. And then we will see some previous academic explanation for consumption of human flesh. And then I would also like to introduce some new reflections, which I have called the shift from the self to non-identical surplus. So, first, quickly some comments on this book, which was written by William Aren's and was published in 1978, Man-Eating Myth, Anthropology and Anthropophagy, in which Mr. Aren's questioned social sciences and methodology and proposed that the act of cannibalism was basically a fantasy of the Western world, something that could hardly be proven and existed basically, according to Mr. Aren's, in the collective unconsciousness. So Aren's cannibalism was surely never something that could be improved as a practice among people. So, but if we have take a closer look at the motivations of this book, Mr. Aren's, he was, as he himself tells in his introduction, at a certain moment he was walking in his village in Tanzania, in Africa, with his local informant at the beginning of his field work, and suddenly there was a man standing in the street, and he says something to Mr. Aren's in Swahili. So it was just at the beginning of his fieldwork, so Mr. Aren's had no idea what this man was saying, and he insisted to his informant that he tell him what this man was shouting. And then, after insisting, the man said, this man was shouting to you that you are a blood sucker. So, this really, Mr. Aren's really took this very personally. As you can see in this introduction, he says, I was very disturbed by the tenacity of their belief in this current variation on the theme of cannibalism without the slightest trace of concrete evidence. So apparently it bothered him so much that he decided to write a whole book to show his distaste about the subject. So apart from some exceptional cases of survival cannibalism, he says that all these are prejudices and accusations or rumors about the other are stories of the supernatural. So the cannibal invariably serves as a symbol of the devil. So for Mr. Aren's and for other academics, cannibalism is by definition a problematic subject. And if we take a look at this analysis, you can easily see where his frustration comes from. first of all, his obsession with finding concrete evidence prevented him really from understanding the logic and the motivation for eating human flesh. So, as he says, according to our view of the natural universe, it is physically impossible for you to be attacked by a sorceress. And also, he said, humans, even Africans, cannot transform themselves into animals, although they claim to have done so. So for Arendt's, cannibalism was something that simply could not be explained with rational arguments, and therefore it could also not exist. But if I make a quick comparison with two examples of Mexico, just like Mr. Arendt was called a blood supper in Tanzania, we know that nowadays in the Chamula village, the Maya community in the south of Mexico, they also consider that people from the United States probably must be savages, and they also probably must be cannibals, because they live so far away from Maya civilization. And if we go back in time, 500 years ago, when the first Spanish arrived in Mexico, the Nahuatl-speaking, the Aztecs, the Nahuatl-speaking people, the first thing they said when they saw this white bearded man is these people, they were actually not sure if they were people. They said these must be Tegules and Teguruani, gods and human heart eaters. So Mr. Arendt was definitely not alone in that sad accusation. So if we have a look at the historical facts on the historical sources on Aztec and Mesoamerican cannibalism, the systematic analysis over the last 10 years of historical sources indicates that anthropophagy was a known practice in various parts of what is now Mexico. According to the Spanish friar Toribio de Benavente, also known as Motorinía, human flesh was commonly, I quote, was commonly eaten by the main lords, the merchants, and the ministers of the temples. So the social elite, priests and merchants, which have the privilege to eat human flesh. However, available data about the geographical distribution of cannibalistic practices is much more abundant than our knowledge about its temporal continuity. Most of the information is limited to the late post-classic period, 1300, 1519, and colonial period, 16th and 17th century. In some testimonies, the existence of cannibalism is denied for various reasons. The first reason is that probably not all ethnic groups actually practice cannibalism. And the second reason is that repressive socio-political colonial circumstances resulted in denial of what was considered by the Spanish a diabolical practice. In many cases, there is a lack of adequate historical information about certain regions. Drawing on the information available, I agree with COV&R brief listing at least the Tarascans from Michoacán, the Itza from Yucatan, the Lacandon from Chiapas, and the Aztecs, the Nahuatl-speaking people from the central of Mexico, as among those who consistently engaged in such practices. Among these, the consumption of human flesh was largely the privilege, as I already mentioned, of the social elite, just as actually also eating game animals was. And in 1985, one of our colleagues, Philip Gonzalez Torres, comments in her study on Mexican human sacrifice, I quote, "We suppose that victims, whom there were kinship ties would not be eaten. Indeed, we have 16th century information indicating that the Mexica did not consume the flesh of someone from the same community, so there was no so-called endo cannibalism. However, as we will see, this is only partially true, since there is a direct relationship between victims who will be consumed and indigenous kitchen. The majority of the testimonies are directly associated with war activity, which sheds some interesting light on the relationship between American warfare, human sacrifice, and cannibalistic practices. For example, in the questionnaire of the Relación de San Paulo, which is more or less 1565, it is written, I quote, "Some towns fought against others, not because of subjection or vassalage, but because those who died in warfare were eaten, and the same fate awaited those who were captured." It is the Dominican friar Diego Durán who gives us an essential clue for understanding this relationship. When the Mexica were in need of some sacrificial victims at the opening of the opening ceremony of the main temple here in Mexico, one of the governors says that he proposes to go to the market, which is actually an euphemism or a metaphor for the battlefield, in the frontier zone with the enemy, and I quote, "Where our God can go with his warriors to buy victims to eat. I declare the center of this market in Tlaxcala and Huejotzingo, enemies of the Mexica." It was also said that the Mexica war god, Huitzilopochtli, had a special preference for the flesh of those close neighbors, since they were like a herd of tortillas, while other ethnic groups who lived further away did not taste so good because they spoke a strange language and they were barbarians. That is in Diego Durán. According to the 16th century Spanish writer Cervantes de Salazar, the fact that Hernán Cortés, the Spanish captain, sometimes released prisoners captured in battle, I quote, was something very new for the Indians. Fue cosa bien buena para los indios. As the Franciscan Mendieta observes, as a general indigenous rule, they never, I quote, they never rescued or freed any captive, no matter how important a lord he might be, and the greater the lord he was, the more they kept him to sacrifice. So to escape for a nobleman would actually be seen as a disgrace, even by his own people, and he ran the risk of being killed if he did so. We have some information, quite some precise information, on the consumption of war captives at various calendar festivals and special occasions. However, it is important to notice that the Spanish friars also precisely indicated in what circumstances a victim was not consumed, albeit without an explanation. And a detailed analysis of the consumed versus the not consumed victims results really in a consistent and coherent indigenous worldview. In another sense, this also means that skeptical voices claim that the Spanish invaders invented the stories of indigenous cannibalism should seriously question their position. The information available about the sacrifice sacrificial and cannibalistic practices among the Nahuatl groups is uneven. We have some references of consuming human flesh in Nahuatl, but unfortunately there is only one author, Cristóbal del Castillo, who mentions the word tlacanaca or listli, the act of eating human flesh. Descriptions of sacrificial rites are abundant, as we already saw with Jan Olivier's lecture, as is data regarding how human flesh was distributed, but very little is known about the details of domestic or communal feasting. As we already saw with Guillaume Olivier, human sacrifice was mostly performed by extracting the heart of the victim, followed by decapitation, so that the gods would be fed with his heart and his blood, indicating in some cases that the priest consumed the human heart. The body of the captive was then removed to the house of the captor to be eaten. I quote Bernardino de Sahagún. There they portioned him out, they cut him into pieces, they distributed him. There they made each one an offering of a bowl of stew of dried maize called tlacatlauri. They gave it to each one, on each went a piece of the flesh of the captive. Other sources confirm cooking with corn and water. In each instance, one of the ties of the victim was reserved for the Tlatoani, the highest governor or king of Mizuma. If more than one person was actually involved, or one warrior, in the capturing of the enemy, it was decided how his body parts would be distributed before the cooking, in accordance with the relative participation of each of the respective warriors involved in capturing the enemy. In a remarkable testimony, Bernardino de Sahagún describes this distribution, which is also actually in the Nahuatl version, but this is from the Spanish version, translated from English, but there was also, this was also written down in Nahuatl by Nahuatl speaking informants. So when they captured one enemy with 3 or 4 people, the one who had stood out the most took the body of the captive and the right thigh and leg. The second most prominent took the left thigh and leg. The third, the right arm. The fourth, the left arm. On the elbow above. The fifth, the right arm, elbow below. And the sixth, the left arm, elbow below. So the bigger the trophy, the more pieces could be distributed as gifts, earning prestige. Another account by Chimalpai in Nahuatl offers a brief but detailed description of a dismemberment in the year 1459, so this is a historical event, carried out by someone named Tomino. I quote, and they cut up 5 or 6 nobles from Tlamanalco. From each person, they took 5 parts. Their trunks were cut at the joints, at the necks, they were beheaded. They also cut the joints of both elbows, the joints of the knees, the flesh of the throat. So we have the verb in Nahuatl, teteki, nite, which means to dismember or cut someone. As in many other similar cases in different parts of the world, the captor or the hunter distributed the flesh of his own prisoner or prey, but he himself was not allowed to consume it. In the words of Sahagún, I quote, but the captor could not eat the flesh of his captive, because he said, shall I perchance eat my very self? So this is the identification process Dr. Olivier also mentioned. For when he took the captive, he had said, he is my beloved son. And the captive had said, he is my beloved father. So I will come back in a minute to this strange kinship construction that was built on the battlefield. A piece of the cooked flesh of the captive was given bonus as a gift to the captor's kinspeople, or entered with other fillets into a dynamic of exchange between nobles. Pieces of flesh were exchanged for blankets. In this way, the captor signaled that he was non-selfish, to socially redeem himself after committing the predatory act of capturing the enemy. In the words of Carlos Fausto, a Brazilian ethnographer, this whole dynamic can be defined as a productive consumption in two phases. First, the capturing of the enemy, which is the external predation, and then second, the exchange and the circulation of the flesh, which is the internal production. 16th century sources indicate that the consumption of the slain captive's body was thought to confer some kind of divinization. During the ceremonial feast of Lakashida Waliski, for example, it was said that those who ate the flesh of the flayed warriors, I quote, would be considered gods. In his Historia de las Indias de Nueva España, the Dominican friar Diego Dunn also commands on the consumption of other human beings as a means to become divine, writing, I quote, that flesh was held to be so sacred that in eating it they taught themselves to be sanctified. On the other hand, it is pertinent to remember that on several occasions the Spanish soldiers witnessed instances of indigenous cannibalism in the several long months of combat they engaged in during the first few years following their arrival. Despite the prevailing notion that anthropophagy was practiced exclusively within the context of human sacrifice, these testimonies indicate that this consumption was not necessarily related to a sacrificial feast. So the question that comes up then is how to explain these instances of consumption outside of the ceremonial context of a communal meal. I would also like to add that we have coherent information on cannibalism in the archaeological field. For instance, in Tlatelolco, a post-classic site closely related to the Mexica, just some kilometers from here, the physical anthropologist Carmen Vijuan analyzed the remains of a burial site consisting of roughly 150 individuals, which you can see there on the main photo. Bones at the site display cut marks, evidence of blows and other physical trauma. In some cases, anatomical parts are completely dismembered. Apparently, after these victims were sacrificed, their soft tissues were separated from their arms, hips, thighs, and legs, which leads the physical anthropologist to conclude that they were likely dismembered and then eaten in a communal state-sponsored banquet. And this is actually not the only case we have from Mesoamerica. Apart from the warriors, the second group of consumed victims were slaves bought in the market by some prominent Persians, probably long-distance traders, who were also granted the right to eat human flesh. The question is why? They organized sumptuous banquets where they served ceremonially baited slaves called in Nahuatl Teotl Ixitla, who were thought to be personifications of the gods. It is worth noting, however, that this practice of eating slaves transformed into gods, a theophagy disguised as an anthropophagy, by Persians is only documented from Mexico, Tenochtitlan, and not in other parts of Mesoamerica. So during the feast, the Mexica feast of Panquetzalisli, for instance, the victim was dressed up like warriors and embodied the sun god, the slaves turned into gods were then sacrificed, and taking each of them, the merchant host, I quote, cooked the victim in a pot. Separately in a pot, they cooked the grains of maize. They served the flesh on it. They placed only a little on top of it. No chili did they add to it, they only sprinkled salt on it. Indeed, all the kinsmen ate of it. To this day, only a handful of scholars have advanced our understanding of Aztec cannibalism. The close relationship between cannibalism and human sacrifice is a subject of debate, and sometimes resembles the question of which came first, the chicken or the egg. Mesoamerican studies have overwhelmingly focused on human sacrifice, since anthropophagy has been basically understood as an integral part of this sacrificial complex, as we will see soon. This should not come as a surprise, since 16th century friars, as well as 19th century evolutionists, deliberately limited their analysis of Mesoamerican cannibalism to its practice within this sacrificial context, that is, as a consecration of human flesh, in order to reinforce the notion that cannibalism within the complex of Mesoamerican society was a kind of civilized anthropophagy that stood out from other instances of cannibalism practiced in so-called primitive communities elsewhere. So even today, explanations of Mesoamerican anthropophagy are largely limited to a discussion of its function as the eating of a divinized body to sacralize oneself. This precedent was set by the 16th century Sahagún, who claimed that in Mesoamerica people consumed human flesh so that they would be considered gods. But let's have a closer look at some previous explanations. The academic debate really erupted in 1977 with the publication of an article by Michael Harner in which he proposes that Aztec cannibalism was motivated by the nutritional deficiencies of the inhabitants of the basin of Mexico. However, this hypothesis was almost immediately criticized and refuted by specialists who presented compelling data about the indigenous diet that ran counter to this argument. From then on, beginning in the late 70s, academic scholars such as Marshall Salins, Christian Duverger, Lulu González Torres, Nájera Coronado, David Carrasco, and Michel Pirauchi, among others, began to investigate the phenomenon of the consumption of a prisoner of war or a slave who personified a god, with the intention of establishing a typology of cannibalism and to better understand its function and symbolism as a religious ritual. The main focus has been on the idea of a divine cannibalism by way of feeding the sun and earth with the hearts and blood of sacrificial victims. This explanation is built on existing theories of human sacrifice, especially by Bert and Moss, that centered on cannibalism as a means of assimilating or achieving communion with the divine through the consumption of a consecrated body, that of a victim burned goat. In this school of theory, the assimilation of the victim substituted by the captain is the analytical focal point. In the words of the French archaeologist Claude Baudis, at this point we would like to suggest that in Mesoamerican religions, the sacrifice of self is primary, while the sacrifice of the other is secondary. The first has its limits. It cannot be total, but only in the case of suicide. An extreme case and by exceptional force. However, the total gift of self can be realized thanks to the sacrifice sacrifice of a human victim with the express condition of being equal to it. Human sacrifice then appears as a substitute for the self-sacrifice in which the victim represents the ego. So the prevailing assumption in this long-standing traditional academic approach is that the taking of prisoners during warfare was predominantly, if not exclusively, motivated by the need to acquire sacrificial victims that would facilitate the above-described interaction between the human real and the divine one, based on the gift of self. However, I contend that this perception is worked upon expanding. In the first place, following two colleagues, Andrew Shevek and John Morano, we should pose the question, was a ritual sacrifice the sole motivation for captive taking, or did this practice possess a deeper socio-political significance? My aim here is not to question the validity of the existing scholarship on the subject, but rather to shift the focus of analysis of cannibalism in Mesoamerica from an almost exclusive emphasis on the sacrificial human-God relationship to its function as a defining mechanism in inter-ethnic relationships. Because cannibalism was not exclusively practiced in relation to sacrificial rituals, but also involved in a whole set of other social dimensions, I argue that this practice, as consumption of the other, should be integrated into a more expansive model that takes into account all cosmic communities, humans and non-humans alike. I argue that it would be more accurate to describe Mesoamerican anthropophagy as a kind of cosmophagy, a predatory dynamic which seems closer to indigenous ontology, in which the consumption of the body of the other has a transformational dimension and plays a constitutive role in regenerating society. Following Guillaume Olivier, who noticed the essential role of the enemy in shaping identity, I proposed a new interpretation of an indigenous war that the Mexica called the Flowering War. There I argue that this specific type of warfare, which involves the capturing of culturally relevant enemies, functions as an alternative to marriage for making intercommunal social bonds, structurally resembling other types such as 16th century Brazilian Tupinamba warfare or the 18th century Iroquois mourning war. Just like giving biological birth was like capturing an enemy, taking an enemy was equalized with giving birth. A virtual son was born on the battlefield with the following words that we already saw, and he is my beloved son, and the prisoner said, he is my beloved father. So instead of establishing kinship relations through marriage, the Flowering War served to maintain a violent political relationship that permitted a form of virtual affinity between communities with the same moral values as establishing a peaceful alliance. Central Mexican sources in Spanish and Nahuatl, as well as Clearfield known as the 16th century testimony, indicate that closely related groups engaged in a form of perpetual conflict. As proposed for some Melanesian societies, this had the function of building a social antagonism. Periods of violent feuding with the exchange of the virtual sons were interrupted by secret political and ritual diplomacy during festivals, as well as the exchange of goods. Although detailed information is scarce, we have some historical and mythological sources that suggest that engaging in cross-cutting intermarriage as a means of solidifying political alliances was considered problematic in warrior societies. As the French anthropologist Lady Strauss observed, intermarriage policy is the counterpart of warfare. The following 16th century declaration in Diego Durán should make this clear. I quote, "Because the Mexicans have reigned for so many years and are already so multiplied and related to all nations, so there are few towns in the region that are not married. They, the Mexicans, with our daughters, and their daughters with us. And this is one of the reasons that makes warfare impossible. So marriage makes warfare impossible. In selecting virtual kin warfare, a noble warrior who spoke the same language and had a common historical and mythical background was the most acceptable candidate for incorporation, including incorporation by consumption. He would thus become a son or a brother, and the two would be brothers, yet at the same time enemies. Not identical, but neither totally different. This person would ideally have the closest dimension of one's own ethnocentric humanity, so his consumption would not violate the Aztec god's denial to eat barbarians who spoke a strange language. The mutual taking of captives was based on the kind of covenant understood as permissions to take a prisoner from the enemy. For instance, when the Chalcas, enemies of the Mexica, wanted to celebrate the festival of their god Camaxtli, they sent the following message to the enemy. Mexican brothers, you must know that from today in 5 days we will have the festival of our god Camaxtli. We ask you that on the same day of our god, you go out into the battlefield because we want to celebrate his feast with your flesh. That the ideal captive was similar, yet not identical to the captor aligns well with prevailing notions of Mesoamerican human sacrifice as a projection of the self onto the other, with the victim acting as a self-substitute. The prisoner underwent a transformation which consisted in familiarizing him as if he was part of the community. This domestication permitted, finally, consubstantialization at the moment of being sacrificed. So, now I would like to go to the argument of the non-identical surplus. However, that the inverse assimilation also occurred, the captor becoming his captive, has not received the same attention, besides the recognition of his symbolic death at the moment his prisoner was sacrificed. In order to attain full personhood, as well as for purposes of individual and social differentiation and regeneration, this kind of enemy becoming was essential. This leads us to a second consideration that goes beyond the sacrificial context. Maybe not the identical aspect should be the focus, but the other differences. As we saw already, the ideal identical, which is the one with the slightest difference, was the enemy with approximate and culturally common history. It seems that for strictly sacrificial purposes, the gift of self, it was essential to create an identical. However, if we take the constitutive role of the enemy in mind, as Olivier has observed, and want to get a more complete picture of the role of captive taking, it is essential to look at the differences of the the other, of the enemy. In the Savage Mind, the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss observes that when the edible parts are of a shared nature, in which animal and human flesh are alike, or if you want to, human flesh and human flesh, the assimilable or consubstantial generates identicals. However, the inedible parts are differentiations of nature transformed into culturally differentiated emblems. In other words, an exchange of similarities for differences. Viveros de Castro has framed this as the economy of predatory alterity. The notion that a society's interior is constituted by the capture of symbolic resources from the outside. Resources like names, souls, people, trophies, words, memories, etc. So I argue that, similar to marriage, the Aztec family war was a way to acquire these differences from the outside, with specific benefits for society's reproduction on both a social and an individual level. So let's have a look at what could have been this non-identical surplus. That is the difference that intercommunal warfare was needed to provide. Therefore, it is essential to go through the cannibalistic condition. Alvarado de Sosoma tells us of a famous myth in which the Aztec war god Huitzilopochtli, when he devoured his sister and his 400 uncles, he became a way tzitzit, a creature associated with the underworld and sometimes translated into Spanish as a great demon. This power to transform into a being with the capacity to devour his own kin is striking, and it is a motive that also appears in historical episodes as well. This example should also lead us to consider that who was actually eating who from an ontological point of view has to be reconsidered. To be human was not a constant condition. It was said, as we already saw, of the Aztec king, that because of the captives, he became young, he stood tall, he lived longer, he became filled with fame. Above all, he became brave, thereby making himself terrifying. In this way, the king turned into a Ikhwani or cannibal. He was the greatest exponent of warrior philosophy, and of him it was said, "You are a beast." So getting back to the previous idea of incorporating differences from the outside in addition to serving as a substitute for the self during the sacrificial act, the captive also granted Monali, which is heat, emotional strength, Tequayotili or ferocity, and Cleo fame to his captive. This assimilation of the enemy's heat, ferocity, and fame effectively enemized the captor's ontology and turned him, in my opinion, into an enemy of both sides, a Neko Yalmo in Dunn. Following the capture of an enemy, this newly ambiguous ontological status, the captor demanded his reclusion from society, not only because the man he had once been died the moment his captive was sacrificed, the idea of the gift of the self, but because his newly animalized ontology had to be handled carefully. So the most prestigious transformation or other becoming, as expressed in the words of Viveros de Castro, was achieved through the capture of a noble man, as he possessed and thus bestowed the most heat, ferocity, and fame. This information indicates that beyond being a merely symbolic act, cannibalism in this context becomes a productive space that preys upon open ontological boundaries and engenders profound transformation. So, quickly, some final remarks. Actually, what you see here is this my idea of what should be the transformation. This is one, this is the other, the enemy. So they are in battle, there is a capture, the capturing of the enemy. The enemy humanizes in order to be sacrificed, but the captor goes through a process of enemization and he becomes his enemy. So there is a relation of other becoming which results in someone with a new identity, someone who has the co-essence of his enemy. So in this presentation I have argued that we must analyze Aztec and Mesoamerican cannibalism with a decolonized set of eyes, and that we must theorize it with decolonized ideas. I argue that prevailing Western notions about Aztec and Mesoamerican cannibalism have been too narrowly anthropocentric, hence the common application of the term anthropophagy. As it is not immediately clear, in the case of the Aztecs, whether those who consumed human flesh even considered themselves human during the process of capture and consumption. Therefore, I have sought to encourage us to reconsider the ontological status of the human subject within this context. In the Western world, the civilized versus savage opposition is exclusive and expresses respectively a degree of superiority and inferiority. However, in the indigenous world, individuals, both human and non-human, oscillate between the savage and the civilized. Individuality that allows for both social life and the ability to obtain vital resources to differentiate and regenerate. Yes? Okay.